Hey, everyone, and welcome to Innovation Unplugged, a podcast where we sit down with leaders operating at the intersection of technology, information, infrastructure, and real world systems. I'm Jim Brismitsis, and today I'm joined by Ryan Calkins, actually a close friend of us here at the lab. He led our Edged cluster, which was a nonprofit effort that we had going on. It was Ryan's leadership that made that a very successful event or a successful outcome for us. Ryan is a leader whose experience spans both public policy, port operations, and innovation ecosystems. He's been deeply involved in one of the most critical and often overlooked parts of our economy, ports and infrastructure that powers global trade, energy movement, and regional competitiveness. Today, we'll explore what's really happening inside these systems where innovation is succeeding or failing, and how emerging technologies like AI, connectivity, and edge computing are beginning to reshape the future of ports and energy. Ryan, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks, Jim, and it's so great to see you too. Been a couple of years and really enjoyed my time getting to work with you guys. It's fun to be back for the next 20
Likewise.
minutes. Yeah.
Likewise. Of the many hats that you've worn, Ryan, and you're one of those masters of all trades, my friend. You were a port commissioner, I believe still are a port commissioner for Port of Seattle, correct?
I am, yeah. I'm currently the president of the Port of Seattle Commission, which is, for those unfamiliar, it's a 5-member sort of board that oversees the operations of the Port of Seattle, which includes SeaTac International Airport and, of course, the maritime properties in the Seattle waterfront.
Right. And I think no more have ports been important to us as an economy as in the last 5 to 6 years. And I think ports really came to the forefront of criticality. They've always been critical, but it's one of those things that has just worked so well, and we never really thought about it until COVID hit. And everyone was staying home, and there was a huge strain on the supply chain for a whole bunch of goods, both incoming and outgoing. As a result of that, and you being closely involved with the ecosystem itself, from port operations to policy, from your perspective, how critical are ports, obviously, to our economic and national security?
Well, they are vital to the supply chain. I like to think of ports as kind of the narrow part of the hourglass. You've got these vast production systems at the top of the hourglass that eventually all filter down through ports and then again spread out again to eventually to the consumer through retail outlets or through Amazon and other delivery mechanisms. But everything eventually has to pass through a port. And that's because we are so interconnected globally now in terms of supply chains. So, in our case, in the Port of Seattle, the vast majority of goods serving our market from Asia and beyond come through the Port of Seattle and Tacoma. And for our farmers here in the region and as far afield as the Midwest, to get their goods to market, they have to export through our gateways. And so we have to be up and running 24/7, 365. And as you said, during COVID, we experienced that post-COVID surge in goods transfer. And we didn't meet the moment for a while there where ports around the country were experiencing significantly long dwell times. We had essentially assets locked up in places that we couldn't get through the system. So we had ships at anchor and trucks waiting in queues. And we learned a lot from that about how we can effectively undo that bottleneck. And a lot of it is going to have to do with the development of what we call smart port infrastructure, which I think we'll talk about today.
We will. And actually, Ron, I was going to just go there because if you were to compare the state of the port infrastructure here in the United States, which is land, sea, rail, against, let's say, port operations in Europe and even, dare I say, Asia, kind of where do you see us fitting in terms of the level of maturity or the adoption of technology, and how are those other ports and those other regions faring out against us in terms of the ability to move volume of goods and meet the moments?
I would say that, and you can't generalize across all ports, but for the most part, U.S. ports, I think, are about a decade behind our peers in Asia and Europe, both in terms of physical infrastructure and also the software that the terminal operating systems, what the marine terminal operators use for managing operations on their terminals, but then also for the anticipated cargo flows coming from vessels all the way through the multimodal distribution sites like rail, truck, and last mile delivery. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do. COVID absolutely was a spur to make those investments, and we're beginning to really see a lot of those programs roll out. We use something called a port community system, sometimes a port information system is the term, to begin to tie the data across the supply chain and to essentially raise visibility of where assets are in the process. But those are extremely complicated systems, and we're beginning to see some breakthroughs. California has been a leader on that in the United States. We in the Pacific Northwest are close behind them in developing these systems, but there's a long way to go still.
Yeah, and in terms of that journey, Ryan, if you were to kind of put your finger on where the choke points are, and it's probably likely a combination of different issues that are holding our ability to modernize our port infrastructure. What do you think are our biggest constraints that's holding us back? Is it technology strictly? Is it policy and technology? From your vantage point, I guess, where can we start?
Well, I would say up until recently, our systems had significant enough slack that we could get away with being inefficient. And that's not true anymore. We have, and for a variety of reasons. One of them is the consolidation of shipping at the ownership level. And what that means is, when I first got into this business 20 some years ago, there were dozens of international carriers that owned ocean-going vessels. And so there was a really robust competition amongst vessels, and the vessels themselves were a quarter to a third the size of the average vessel today. And so what's happening is you have these enormous ships now coming into ports that have consolidated operations from, Port of Seattle. We used to have 9 container terminals, essentially. Now we're down to 4, and really practically speaking, 2 that have the capacity to handle these container ships that are now up to 25,000 containers per ship. And as a result of that, there is no room for inefficiency anymore. And if you can't work that inefficiency out of the system, you're not competitive. Efficiency is really driven by data analytics at this point. And so terminals now need to deploy cameras with an AI layer to be able to analyze operations and say, where are we unfortunately touching that container too many times? How do we make sure that the moment it comes off the ship, that the next move is already programmed into the system? They aren't waiting to communicate, by radio, hey, where am I supposed to take this? It's already directed to where it's going to go. And then the same for moving it from a pile to a train or to a truck. And the opposite is true for the exports. And so I think the deployment of that hardware, the cameras, the sensing equipment, and then the AI layer on top of that to really to provide the analysis for how we can achieve efficiency is what most ports are engaged in right now, and that's vital. I think there's a perception that automated cargo handling equipment is an important investment for most ports. That's maybe down the road, but for the most part right now, it's that sensing and analysis that is the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. There's several big ports here in the United States along the West Coast. There's certainly Seattle, Tacoma for the Pacific Northwest. You've got Oakland in the Bay Area, LA Long Beach, and several ports there, Savannah. And every one of those ports has sort of taken a different approach to generating some efficiencies. From the conversations that you and I had several years ago, Ryan, one of the impressions you left with me that was that the Port of LA Long Beach was really ahead in terms of improving its efficiencies. And they did so using data and, dare I say, the A word, using some automation as well. As you look to other port operations here in the United States, how would you say the Port of Tacoma and Seattle are relative to some of these other ports? And is a model like LA Long Beach more sort of to be what the future looks like longer term?
Yeah, and I would reiterate that the San Pedro ports, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, have done an excellent job incorporating some of these next generation technologies, including, I think their port community system has been path breaking, and some of the vendors who have been working with them to establish them are now making those same systems available to other ports around the country. So in some ways, we all benefit. We get to sort of fly in the slipstream of those big ports. And historically, they represent about 40% of the total inbound container volume to the entire United States in those two ports. So you can understand how critical they are. In terms of the Pacific Northwest, we play a slightly different role in the national supply chain picture. So whereas LA Long Beach, they have this enormous endemic market, right? So much of the goods that are coming into those two ports stay within, a 3-hour train or truck trip of that, because there's 30 million people that live within that catchment.
Yep.
For us, we don't have the luxury of a sort of endemic market. We really do need to be an intermodal port where it switches from the ship to the train or the truck to go long haul to Chicago or Minneapolis or somewhere far afield. And so in that sense, we really have to make sure that we're competitive from an operations standpoint. It also means that we have to be more agile than those ports, than LA and Long Beach. They're going to have a very high consistent flow of containers through their ports all the time, rain or shine, recession or boom. And so they can bake into their financial modeling for the purchase of big, expensive assets a long-term payback period. We don't have that luxury. We need to be able to use our ports in a more agile way, which wouldn't allow for that kind of infrastructure investment in a sort of fixed system. And so for us, it actually accentuates the need to use not the automation of equipment, but the back-end processes much more effectively so that we can pivot as needed to accommodate big swings in potential container cargo demand and shift over to things like, right now at one of our terminals, we're doing a lot of roll-on, roll-off cargo, primarily automotive cargo coming from Korea, Hyundai and Kia.
Yep.
And while that's not, the highest and best use of that facility, right now that's what the market needs. And so it wouldn't have made sense to automate that terminal for containers because that just would have been a stranded asset while we were using it for other things.
Yeah, Ryan, as you probably remember, we together launched the first private 5G network down at the Port of Tacoma prior to any other private 5G network being deployed, and that then led to us launching the first private 5G network for Washington United terminals, and now we're actually working with the Port of Tacoma about creating a connectivity fabric for them across critical areas that they operate at the Port of Tacoma, which is going to be our largest network. As you think through the systems, the critical systems that are required, I think it goes without saying that connectivity is one of those systems because you need means to connect to the data, right? Whether it's through AI-based cameras, transponders, or what have you. But other critical technologies that you see are just no-brainers that ports here in the United States, like Port of Tacoma and Seattle, should be considering as part of their operations.
Yeah, let me just reinforce what you said, that the ability to connect the industrial Internet of Things at terminals is existential at this point. You have to be able to deploy these sensors and cameras, tracking devices, all these things that are necessary to know exactly where things are on the terminal. That's true for efficient movement. It's also true for life safety. You've got workers around big, heavy equipment. So yeah, that's absolutely vital. And it was path-breaking work at Tacoma to get that installed and begin to understand how this could work. I would say the other element of this is starting to look beyond just the terminals themselves. So we want to be able to anticipate the arrival of a truck half an hour, 45 minutes before it comes on to, it arrives in our queue. And whether that's through, sensing technology, license plate readers at a critical junction at I-90 and 405, or as it is getting closer to us, or on the opposite side, a recognition that a vessel is maybe behind schedule or ahead of schedule, and so beginning to prepare the workforce and the other modes, letting the railroad operators know, hey, schedule has changed. We need to prepare the unit train in time for arrival on a slightly different schedule. Those kinds of things are vital, and so it's sort of extending the scope of that data awareness even beyond just terminals.
100% agree. Given the time that we had the privilege to work alongside you within the Edge cluster, you got a chance to meet a lot of our startups and actually speak with a lot of our startups around innovation. The port ecosystem has been a bit harder for them to make headway into it. I guess it's an industry that has some old inherent roots, and innovation has been, I wouldn't say shied away from, but it really has to be rock solid before port operators, terminal operators are comfortable in adopting it. What advice would you give to those who are in the innovation world, startup founders, investors, and others around how to really approach this ecosystem?
So the first thing I would say is to go where those operators are. So they're not going to necessarily show up to the tech conferences. You got to go to the maritime conferences and
Right.
and go from a perspective of discovery. Just this is good for every startup to remember, but like your first few meetings really ought to be about listening. What is it that what are the burrs in your saddle as whether you're a terminal operator or a fleet owner, you're a drayage fleet owner, or an expediter who's managing the information flow from Shanghai to the store shelf. What are the problems that these different, in many cases, very large organizations that aren't household names are experiencing as a business? And then the other thing I would say is keep in mind that the maritime industry is not a U.S. industry for the most part. The shipping owner, the United States only has, I think it's 0.4% of the total ocean-going fleet.
Wow.
Their own, yeah. I mean, we have a very, very small ocean-going fleet. For the most part, it's Chinese and European.
Right.
The three big carriers are European. China has a state-owned enterprise carrier system, and so those are the driving forces. So you have to be international if you're going to operate in the maritime space. And beyond that, I would say there is an emerging space around the need for alternative fuels in maritime, driven primarily by regulatory compliance, but it's creating really interesting new opportunities for startups, whether you are a technology startup or a petrochemical startup. That, I would say, is a green field ripe for new technology.
Yep. And shore power has been one of those pain points that has existed in this industry for a very long time. I know our friends at Washington Maritime Blue have been pioneering and pushing for hydrogen-based shore power solutions and others. And it sounds like you're exploring something similar at your current role right now as an advisor for PNNL. But that whole landscape looks like it's changing. We're on the cusp of changing in the future.
It really is. And I know in the United States we've got some headwinds facing renewables and alternative energy,
Yeah.
but the safe bet in the long term is on these technologies. And as we work down that kind of stack from easiest to decarbonize to hardest to decarbonize, where maritime exists, there's real money in breakthroughs that first introduce efficiencies into the system, second enable electrification, and third, come up with options for liquid fuels with a lower carbon intensity.
Yeah. Of the many things that we've ever chatted about, my friend, that I just find fascinating, it's your experience and insight into our local airport here called SeaTac, which is a very, very important aerial hub for the Pacific Northwest. But there's a lot of fun facts about SeaTac Airport that many people are not aware of. And so if you may, I'd love to just explore a couple of those fun facts as we wrap up our podcast for today. So the Pacific Northwest has SeaTac Airport. It is our major hub. Portland's not too far away from us, but nowhere near the size or capacity of SeaTac. I think SeaTac would be sort of in the realm of maybe one of the top 10 airports here in the United States. But it's been going through a ton of transformation here over the last, 10 years. New terminal remodeling, new the runway that was installed, I think runway 3, whatever it's called. But where are we at with SeaTac today? There's just a lot of change and still a lot of change forthcoming.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I would say we're about a third of the way through a major renovation period for SEA. And this first phase that we're concluding right now, which we're really working to make sure is entirely done before World Cup this summer, and we're on schedule, so good news, has included things like the renovation of the North Satellite, a complete revamping of our baggage carousel system, the baggage handling below the airport, so that you can put a bag on at any ticketing concourse and go to any plane anywhere without a human touching it. Nobody's ever seen that, of course, but it's that's a many $billion-dollar project. The opening of the International Arrivals Facility, which is a gem of a place for first timers coming to the Pacific Northwest from all around the world, get to see that. And we're seeing the fruits of that. We now have 58 international destinations, which is one of the top handful of all airports in the United States, on 29 different carriers to 36 different countries. It's truly remarkable. We just opened yesterday or 2 days ago our new direct to Rome. We will be introducing.
Is that Alaska Airline that's doing that?
Yeah. And we've got a few more announcements coming down the pike. I can't reveal yet, but really exciting news. And what's really exciting is that over the next 10 years, we are going to roll out something called the Sustainable Airport Master Plan, which will build a brand new North Terminal, add 20 additional gates, increase transit access to the airport through expanded lanes and a big transit center. As you know, you have to think not only about the airspace and where the planes taxi, but also the ground transportation. How do we get people to and from the airport safely and efficiently? And all of those projects, it'll be at about $1 billion a year in capital improvements for the foreseeable future at SEA.
Well, it's showing me from the last time I flew through, which was about a month and a half ago. It's already a much better passenger experience, despite some of the renovations that are still happening. So I'm excited to see what the next 2/3 brings SEA. Well, Ryan, thank you very much for your time today. You're a busy guy and wear many hats, but we appreciate you spending time with us and sharing your perspectives on what's happening here in the maritime industry and the air industry here in the Pacific Northwest and kind of where the future is going. So with that, I think it's probably time to close our session off on today. Thank you again, Ryan, for sharing your insights and giving us a deeper look into that space that doesn't nearly get as much attention, but yet is so critical to our national economy and to our local economy here. And to all our listeners, don't forget to subscribe to Innovation Unplugged. Leave us a review. Tell us how we're doing and share this with a colleague. Until next time, stay curious and stay unplugged. Again, Ryan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim.